Hello and welcome to this TCPA webinar, Rural Expressions of 20-Minute Neighbourhoods. My name's Julia Thrift and I'm the Director of Healthier Placemaking at the TCPA, the Town and Country Planning Association. And I'm going to be your chair for today. Before we start, I'd like to thank Sport England for supporting this event and also for supporting the TCPA's wider work on creating healthy, active places, working with councils and communities. Next slide, please. In the last few years, there's been a lot of interest in the idea of creating 20-minute neighbourhoods, sometimes called 15-minute neighbourhoods or 15-minute cities, or complete, compact and connected places. Most of the focus of this work and thinking has been around urban areas, but today we're asking, is it possible to achieve this in villages and rural places? To help answer this question, we've got a fantastic range of speakers who will explore it from a different range of viewpoints, as you can see here on the agenda. And before we get going, I'd like to remind you that if you want to ask one of our speakers a question, please can you post your questions in the question and answer box at the bottom of your screen. You're welcome to use the chat as well, but we might not pick up questions that are posted there. Next slide, please. For those of you who don't already know, the TCPA is a charity whose vision is for homes, places and communities in which everyone can thrive. We work across the UK and beyond. Next slide, please. During the pandemic lockdown, everyone was forced to live entirely in their own neighbourhoods, and it became really clear that some places worked far better than others. In some places, people had the things that they needed and they could access them really easily within a short walk. In other places, people felt very stranded without the things that they needed, without the green spaces, without the shops, without the other things that make day-to-day life so livable. So at the TCPA, we decided to find out more about the idea of 20-minute neighbourhoods, places in which most people can find most of the things they need most days, within a short walk or cycle. We researched and published a guide to creating 20-minute neighbourhoods in England. It's been hugely popular, downloaded thousands of times, one of the most popular things on the TCPA's website. We've also held numerous webinars exploring different aspects of what 20-minute neighbourhoods are, why they might be beneficial, and how they can be put into practice. All of this is available on the TCPA's website at the address on your screen, along with a brand new issue of the TCPA journal devoted to 20-minute neighbourhoods with a wide range of really interesting articles. So there's lots and lots of free resources on our website. We do encourage you to take a look. Next slide, please. It now gives me a huge pleasure to welcome our keynote speaker for today, Professor Carlos Moreno. Many of you will be aware of Professor Moreno's work in Paris, supporting the Mayor of Paris's introduction of the 15-minute city idea. Professor Moreno is an internationally acclaimed researcher, scientist, and innovator, pioneering thinking about urban issues, including the 15-minute city concept. He's based at the IAE Paris Sorbonne University, and for the last year, he's led the Global Observatory of Proximities at the World Urban Forum, with UN Habitat, C40 Cities, UCLG and other partners. So welcome, Professor Moreno. We're very pleased to see you today and we're really looking forward to your talk. I'll hand over to you now. I think you're on mute, Professor Moreno.
Yes, you're right.
Fantastic, we can hear you now.
Thank you, dear Julia, for this kind invitations. Thank you to the TCPA for this fantastic webinar. And of course, good morning, all audience for this meeting. I will go to share my short presentation for 20 minutes. I'm totally sorry because I will go to catch up a train just after my presentation. However, for speaking in this concept, this is a new paradigm. How could we transform not only our cities, but how could we transform our territories in a medium and low density, including rurality, for developing this revolution, the revolution of proximity. We have opened a new dialogue on urban and territorial models, and in particular for transforming the concrete practices in a global scale. Just for remembering that the first time when I have published this concept was in October 2016, a few months after the COP21 in Paris. At this moment, the strategic question for this international meeting of countries was how could we avoid this global threat, the global warming for the next decade and for the horizon 2050. I proposed just after the Paris Agreement, this new model available for our cities and available for our towns, our small villages, and even rurality, based on a key concept, a polycentric city, a polycentric territory. For that, we have proposed to develop a new lifestyles, a new urban for the compact zone and territorial for the medium and low density zones, based on 4 pillars. Proximities. Proximities is not only distances, proximities is as well cultural proximities, cognitive proximities, a lot of different immaterial means for creating more social and economical interactions. Mixities for developing more social mixity and functional mixity. Density. Density for having the possibility for mutualizing resources. And it is available as well in the medium and low density zones in rurality, because we have the possibility for creating more common services, for having more shared resources. And the 4th point, ubiquity, for using technologies are a powerful ally for developing more services using today the different remote possibilities. Just for remembering, the mayor of Paris has embraced this concept in February, in November 2019, and she has announced in February 2020 the capital importance, the vital importance of this concept for Paris in her electoral campaign. She won, and she has started at the same time, unfortunately, with the COVID-19 and the C40 cities global network has embraced as well this concept. We have developed during 3 years now after the pandemic this concept in different continents with the different partners, scientists, international organizations, organization of mayors. If we wanted to put it in a nutshell, this concept on the left, we could observe this idea of a new polycentric organizations, and this is available for the medium and low density territories because it is possible to explore our territories for identifying the different visible and invisible resources in order to share them, to develop new services and to develop new accessibilities for providing more and more real quality of life. On the right, this is the concept of the social circularity. I called 50-minute city for the compact zone, and I called 30-minute territory for the zone with medium and low density. We have defined the same kind of strategic services. This kind of services, each one with a color: to live in the good conditions, to work for reducing daily long commute, to supply for creating shorter circuits, local employment, for having accessibility to local raw materials, shops, one-point shops, to care for the medical services, health and physical services, to learn, for having access to education, culture, and to enjoy with the public spaces for human, for more pedestrianization, more bikeability, with water and air without pollution. And we have defined the 3 new indicators: the indicators of my personal well-being with my family, the indicator with my sociability with my neighbor and my work colleagues, and the indicator of sustainable activities for reducing my CO2 footprint and my otherness with the other people. We have considered that with the polycentric organization, we could naturally develop the short low carbon distances. And with the social circularity, when we have the possibility for providing a functional mixity, for optimizing the intersection of the 6 essential functions, we will generate this new habitability. The name of this model is the high quality of societal life, to mix these 6 essential functions for offering a maximum in a shorter distances. Of course, the real question is not the number, 15 or 30. It will be possible to have 10 or 18 or 20 or 38. The more important point is the roadmap, the trajectory, the path for transforming our cities, our territories in a polycentric, multi-services, multi-uses, and more livable places. The nickname of this social circularity now is the rainbow of the high quality of societal life, for showing the importance of mixing the different colors, given that this is the real way for mixing the different functions. Well, I need to underline that the time is not the same for each one of us. It depends on our physical situation. For a retired person, for a disabled, for a student, for a teenager, for a couple without or with children. For that, it is very important to explore the real condition in our territories, for identify the different profiles of citizens, of inhabitants, of users, and to examine as well the trend for the next year, for the next 5 years, for the next decade of the demographic evolution in our territory. This is very important for proposing a grid of the different services. Of course, for a teenager, 10 minutes, 15 minutes, 20 minutes is not the same possibility for accessing to different services as a retired or disabled person. This is so important for generating the different isochrones for having a real patchwork of different services in this way of proximity, of happy proximity for everyone. We have developed two different tools: a digital platform for exploring our territory with the digitalizations, maps, and different resources with our methodology. And the second one, the proximity fresque for developing this creative workshop, for having the different profiles and to imagine the new services. This is the concrete case in one of our territories in France, for example. We have in this territory 207 inhabitants, but totally spread in a very large territory. In reality, we have more than 100 different towns with no more than 10,000 inhabitants for each one. We have defined the different 6 services. We have explored with our digital platform the 6 essential services for identifying the different services, needs, and possibilities. We have developed the different isochronos for the different kind of population. We have identified as well the different hypotheses today, tomorrow, after tomorrow, on foot, by bike, by car, with the different radius, 50 minutes, 30 minutes. We have developed the different average access with the time calculation. We have developed the different exploration for each one of 6 functions: to live, to work, to supply, etc. And to obtain this kind of radar, this is the indicator of the quality of life. In this case, for example, a single parent family with electrical car, their own bike, and we could observe the different results of the high quality of societal life. This is at the largest scale. And we have included this livability index, housing, urban vitality, people friendliness, risk of exposure. And we have the possibility for explore precisely each one of different hypotheses for the future. With the proximity fresque, this is the manual workshop for giving to the different participants a profile, and with this profile to explore the different challenges for comparing my territorial life now and my territorial life tomorrow, with the individual proposals and in the collective exchange, for having a more social acceptability, more empowerment, and to be aware of the importance to manage this transformation. We are, I am very proud of this webinar today. You are in this way for transforming our small towns and rurality with this 20 minutes territory concept aligned with this happy proximity, 50 minute city, 30 minutes territory. This is the same global movements. On Tuesday in Copenhagen, for the worldwide meeting of the architecture, I will manage a webinar and a conference on proximity and ruralities. We will examine 2 concrete examples in France the town of Saint-Hilaire de Bretnas, 14 square kilometers, less than 5,000 inhabitants. And this is a really very, very nice example of transformation of the concept of 20-minute territory, 30-minute territory with the implementation in small towns. And we will examine as well the city of Plysiu in Poland with the mayor Arkadiusz Ptek. This is a small town with 15,000 inhabitants. And this is as well totally interesting, his development. Just for finishing, I want to invite particularly TCPA for joining the new Global Observatory of Sustainable Proximities created by my chair at Sorbonne University, UN Habitat, UCLG, United Cities and Local Governments, and the C40 cities. This is a new physical and virtual place for sharing our best practices, for exchanging about our different initiatives, for federating researchers, academics, students, for hosting the different economic actors, stakeholders, and to welcome as well citizen civic associations. We have created a website for collecting the information around the world of different initiatives on proximity. In the 5 continents, we have today more than 100 initiatives developed in this way. How could we generate a new paradigm for living, for working differently, based on shorter distances, low carbon mobilities, a more local vibrant economy, and more inclusive cities and territories. Thank you so much, and I wish you a nice webinar on proximities. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Professor Moreno. That was a fantastic overview of what's been achieved so far, and really interesting to see the data and mapping and thinking that's going into creating places of happy proximities, which is a phrase I really love. We do have some questions. I believe you've got a couple of minutes that you can stay with us and take a few questions. One of them inevitably is about the criticism that the concept of 15-minute cities or 20-minute neighbourhoods is currently attracting. Some of the criticism has been quite bizarre, some of it less so. But what's your response when people say, why are you forcing us to stay in our neighbourhoods, and come out with other things like that? What do you say to people?
Yes, we have different good criticism. We have the very poor criticism, the conspiracy mongers, the new climate lockdown, the new climate denialist. This is just the conspiracy blocks of in the nice debate is on our real capability for implementing a social mixity. I think that the good criticism, the good debate is how could we develop a social mixity for avoiding a new gentrification in cities or in territories. This is the essential point. And for that, the first point is to invite the different criticists for visiting the different implementation, because it's no more an idea, this is no more a concept in the brain of Moreno. It was the case 10 years ago in 2010, when I had started It was an idea in 2016 when I proposed for the first time. It was an idea until 2018 when the mayor of Paris has embraced the concept. Today, 3 years after, we have a lot of different implementation concretely with this point. The 50-minute city, the 30-minute territory, 20-minute territory, we needed to consider as a new public policy, the urban or territorial public policy. We need to develop this concept based on the common good as a strategic way for the local governors, mayor, president of metropolises, president of region. This is not a question just for nourishing a new business model for the private sector. When we went to accept that the private sector takes this concept for developing the new closed districts, the new style for the different boroughs. This is a way for developing this new gentrification. When we have decided that this is the new urban or territorial policy, in Paris, the essential question, in fact, today is a real transformation, given that now we have voted the new local urban and territorial plan as the new urban policy for the next 20 years. And today, this is the public urban and territorial policy. In the region Île-de-France, we have a lot of small towns. The president of the region, the mayor of Paris is the left party. The president of the region is the right party. And in the region, the decision took was to implement the same model in the scale of the region, and including a lot of different small towns, small territories with a very low density. And this is a new project from 2024 until 2040. This is the point. This is the essential point. If you have the possibility for transforming this idea in a new local urban plan, territorial urban plan, in the new strategy, in Scotland, this is the decision. The Scottish Parliament has voted in February the new strategic plan, 20-minute territory, 20-minute neighborhood for the Scotland territory. This is the and after we need, of course, to take care for developing the social mixity. And the key for developing the social mixity is the social housing for escaping to ghettoization. If we have a social housing mixed with the other different kind of housing, we have the mixity. This is the case, for example, in Paris. We have today more than 25% of social housing, including in the very expensive districts. We have the key for them. The risk for the ghettoization is when we have, on the one hand, the very expensive house in the physical and geographical sector, and another, the worker class or the working class or the poor people, just in the social housing with the cheaper. We need to mix. Mixity is the key for avoiding gentrification.
That's a fantastic answer. Thank you very much. And we were so aware when we were researching our guide to 20-minute neighbourhoods that places that had already started implementing them discovered that people love them, people want to move to those areas, and there's a real risk of gentrification if you don't make sure you include really good affordable homes, which in England is a struggle at the moment.
Yes.
But it absolutely has to benefit everybody. And that's such a good point. Unfortunately, I think Professor Moreno now has to leave, but I'd like to thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. I'm sure we'll all look at your website for the Global Proximities Observatory, which sounds like a fantastic initiative. Please. We'd love to be part of it, and we will keep in touch with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Julia. Goodbye, everyone.
And now, after that international perspective, we're going to start looking at some of the really exciting innovation that's happening in the UK. And just to remind everybody that this webinar is being recorded, and a recording will be available on the TCPA's website. If you search for our 20-minute neighbourhoods section, there's lots of resources, and that's where it'll be posted. So our next speakers are Sarah Featherstone and Judith Sykes. Sarah and Judith collaborate on Velocity, which I hope I've pronounced correctly. Is it Velocity? A strategic vision to solve some of the most critical issues facing the countryside today. Velocity is delivered by an all-woman team of industry experts with the vision to enrich village life and a sense of place, while creating new homes and working environments in healthy and socially cohesive places. So over to you, Sarah and Judith.
Thank you, Julia. So you're going to hear first from myself and then about how we've developed the vision, and then my colleague Sarah is going to talk about how we're evolving that in practice. So yes, the name is a clever play on words, so Velocity or Velocity, but this is about our response to rural countryside issues. It's a vision for how we can grow villages differently through better connectivity and less reliance on the car. So effectively, we're creating a 20-minute neighbourhood in the countryside. If you go to the next slide. So this is our team that you introduced. And so we are a group of friends who really enjoy cycling. But we're also professional architects, planners and engineers. And we got together 6 years ago in 2017 to do a response to the National Infrastructure Commission's placemaking competition. And that competition was looking at how you could deliver 1 million new homes in the Oxford to Cambridge tech corridor that would be supported by new investment into infrastructure, and particularly the rail infrastructure. And Velocity was the winning idea of that competition. So next slide. Instead of looking at town expansions or big new towns, like the other submissions to the competition, we looked at villages because they already exist, they already have a strong sense of place, but there are a number of issues that villages face, largely as a result of car dependency. But we were seeing a loss of community facilities, so shops, pubs, schools were closing. Aligned with that, a degree of isolation, aging population because of the lack of range of housing stock. And so a number of issues that we saw. Next slide, please. And we also observed that development is happening in villages, but it tends to be quite sprawling and ad hoc. And actually, if we properly planned rural intensification, that we could create much better places than what's been developed at the moment, with the potential loss of their own identity and the sort of sprawl that eats into the countryside and often creates housing that people just can't afford as well. So it's both the nature of development and the type of development that's being delivered. If you go to the next slide. Next slide, please. Thank you. So in the context of the housing crisis that we're seeing in the UK, but particularly in the countryside, we also had COVID, which saw a number of people moving out of cities into more rural context. And actually, there's over 15,000 villages in England and Wales, and many of them are only a few miles apart. So by connecting them up and with a fine-grained network of walking and cycling, and seeing the connections between those villages, we felt that you could easily support some growth without being car dependent. So to convey this principle, we created a manifesto of 5 key principles, which I'm just going to introduce you now. So the first principle is the headline, people over cars. If you go to the next slide, sorry. Yeah, people over cars, creating this new network. The second principle, if you go to the next slide, is hugely important. It's providing those facilities and communities and development in a very compact way, being light-footed, and keeping villages walkable, and importantly protecting the character of those existing villages. Next slide. Third principle is about connected, not isolated. So looking not at one village, but how villages act in a cluster that can promote the sharing economy. And so at this scale, we're sort of promoting that concept of the 20-minute neighbourhood within the countryside. And then the fourth principle is looking at how opportunities can be created through development, and embracing the opportunities of rural economies, and that sort of shift as well that happened during COVID to creating businesses within a rural context. So bringing economic opportunities into the countryside. And then the last principle on the next slide is about creating resilient places, and so how we can use development to restore the landscape and create climate resilient communities. If you go to the next slide. So this is our diagram of the Oxford-Cambridge corridor, and we mapped all of the villages and how they could be linked together through that corridor and linking into existing railway stations. And the radius is about 7 miles, which is what we think you can easily sort of cycle on a day-to-day basis. Go to the next slide. So our strategy was very much about mapping existing networks and expanding on those and improving them to be able to take cycling, or what we would also call mixed mobility, so it's mobility services for all. And by pushing cars to the edge of those villages, we can create both fast and slow networks to suit different uses. If you go to the next slide. So in the centre of the village cluster, we have this amazing facility which we're calling the Big Back Garden. It's a productive landscape, and since even we've developed this proposition, you can see the policies coming out of government which are about restoring the landscape and having a different approach to agriculture in a rural context. It's about enhancing the biodiversity and nature recovery within that natural landscape, and then providing an accessible landscape as well. So reconnecting people with nature and creating more and supporting activity in that landscape. Go to the next slide. And as well as sort of cycling, our proposal is very much based on the sharing economy, and that is at different scales. So the clusters of villages that link together, scaling that up to sort of see a town cluster with the sort of strategic infrastructure, and then looking within a village how those community facilities are shared, and then even within a development, looking at sort of co-housing models and how those could implement or support a sharing approach. So very much about sharing as a way of supporting those common facilities. If you go to the next slide. And then we tested this principle, and we spoke to local people on a cycle ride through the villages that we were looking at, and got some really interesting feedback, and clearly an appetite from people living in these villages to do something differently. And then the last slide before I hand over to Sarah is the reimagined village. So you can see that cars are pushed to the edge. We have a community hub which is doing multiple things. It's a mobility hub. It's where resources can be shared. It's where it provides a sort of logistics where deliveries can come into. So that's at the edge of the village. New development is introduced around the historic core, and the historic core is protected. We convert farm buildings into new workspaces, and we introduce new housing sensitively within the village context. So we are delighted that it's been so well received, and Sarah's now going to tell you a little bit about how now we're evolving this concept.
Thank you, Judith. Next slide. Yeah. So we've been thinking hard about what new housing and new building might look like in a village. It needs to be a higher density. It needs to be more light-footed. So we would take our cues from the local vernacular. which is not only the small picturesque workers' cottages that you see in villages, but also the larger industrial farm buildings, and combine these with new energy efficient technologies. The diagram on the right looks at radically reducing the amount of space given to roads and cars, which at the moment in a typical house builders development can take up to 40% of a development. And in fact, what we've done is we've done a little analysis of a typical house builders scheme. Next slide, please, to understand how land is currently being apportioned. So this is an aerial view of a typical house builder's rural housing scheme. And we know it's rural because it's got this slightly ad hoc, informal layout. And we abstracted that, next view slide, please, abstracted that to break it down into the different land uses. And actually the revelation is quite frightening. So the next slide, please. This is the amount of land that was given over to the homes. Next slide, please. This is the amount of land given to green space, which is largely the private gardens. Next slide. This is the land given to trees. We could only find one in that development. Next slide. This is to pedestrians. So this is sadly just the sort of narrow paths, which, as you can see, get kind of broken up and crisscrossed by cars. Next slide, please. And this is the amount of land given over to roads, driving, parking. It's a lot. And then the next slide, please. This is the space given to social infrastructure and community facilities. We couldn't find anything in this development. So next slide, please. Velocity obviously feel there is an alternative vision to this, where we can look at radically reducing the amount of land given to cars and give over to more green space, light-footed housing, to play spaces, orchards, and shared open green spaces. So moving on to how we've begun to implement this and take it beyond winning the competition 3 or 4 years ago. Next slide, please. We have spoken widely with government bodies. We've exhibited in exhibitions. We went to the Oslo Triennale, where they had the theme of degrowth, and presented our manifesto. And we've partnered with like-minded organisations like Brompton, who want to extend into the countryside and increase active travel modes. Next slide, please. Research funding has also helped us develop different strands of our vision. And we've used this in some cases to visit a number of case studies in Sweden, Denmark, and also closer to home. So here we looked at a little village called Dent in the Yorkshire Dales, partly because we were aware it had much higher density housing within its village core, but also for its really innovative sort of car-free approaches. So it is, it's got narrow cobbled streets, the homes are largely terraced, and due to the narrowness of streets, back in the 70s, the villagers actually got together and created a grasscrete field that blends into the landscape and is at the edge of the village, so that it becomes this car-free village. And as a result, I think it's a really strong community environment, and it's also perceived to be super picturesque. It's a bit of a honeypot in the summertime, but of course has this much, much higher density housing. So moving on from that, next slide, please. We were very lucky about 3 years ago to be introduced to Blenheim Estate. They are large landowners with a palace, park, and land in a number of villages around the park. You probably know Blenheim Palace. It's just outside Oxford. And this has given us an opportunity to pilot our vision. They are very aware of their role as stewards of a vast area of land, and they've got some very ambitious targets to meet net zero over the next 20, 30 years. And this cluster of villages that sit around the park are also very well connected to train stations. So our first piece of work with them was developing this emerging vision for connecting the 7 villages around the palace and park and growing them over a 20, 30-year plan, so that their population as a cluster is big enough to support all the services that they've lost, and over time they become a car-free cluster. Next slide, please. So we looked at all the potential daily routes that people may want to take and how to incentivize active travel using different modes of transportation and different routes that are more direct, and modes of transportation that might be something like the children's cycle bus or electric buggies for older people. This has really brought traction from local communities. A group called the Village Travel Network have got together and have representatives of the 7 villages coming together and realising that they have much more weight to lobby for safer cycle and walk routes by working together. And we've already been able to trial a couple of routes across Blenheim Park. One was set up during COVID when the school bus wasn't able to run at full capacity. Blenheim allowed school children to cycle across, and this is now still in place. And then a couple of months ago, we set up another path that links the train station on one side of the park to the villages on the other. And there are more to follow, so this is great. And the VTN, the Village Travel Network Group, are working with ourselves to submit a proposition, a plan to the local cycle and walking infrastructure plan, the LCWIP, and that's something that we hope will come through and be ratified later this year. Next slide, please. So we're also, with Blenheim, piloting more light-footed housing typologies. We're looking at a small site at the moment in the middle of one of the villages, which will provide 40 homes and a community hub with co-work space. It very much follows the VeloCity principles. It's a kind of micro version of that. It pushes cars to the edge. It has a central walking cycle route that serves both the homes within the development, but also provides a much safer route that links different village activities, the school to the playing fields, for example. The new homes will be affordable. Blenheim have an affordable housing model that they wish to expand, and they'll be built in clusters of 8 or 9 homes to passive house standards, and they sit around a kind of, each of these 8 or 9 homes sit around a shared open space, which is very much the mini version of the big back garden that Judith spoke about. Next slide. So with Blenheim, we have been consulting with the wider community, talking to local authorities and councillors, and currently are looking to submit our strategy to the OCC and WODC, West Oxfordshire District Council, local plan, in the hope that it may be embedded in that coming forward over the next 20, 30 years. And if it does, we see this sort of vision for the Blenheim village cluster, if you like, being a sort of pilot for this rural 20-minute neighbourhood. And we could see many more coming forward across this county if that was to happen. And I think it really is an opportunity to shift the growth and investment from towns to the rural communities where there is now so much pressure for new housing. Next slide, please. And we're applying these principles elsewhere. In Bridport and Dorset, we're partnering with rail engineers to reverse beaching and open up one of the old rail lines, which due to the bigger trains that used to be on them, is wide enough now to put a new light rail track alongside a cycle and walk route. So this is a wonderful opportunity not only to bring tourists down to the coast, but also to link the hundreds of little villages that exist along that route. We're also looking at valley settlements in Wales, where villages tend to be located in a much more linear pattern along steep river valleys, which really makes it more challenging and increases that isolation as villages are separated in different valleys. So it's a little bit like Dent, actually, and clearly e-bikes and electric buggies are going to be essential. Next slide, please. So we think VeloCity's vision for villages and the countryside is totally scalable and can have a far wider impact. It's practical and low cost because it's reusing existing infrastructure, the bridleways and footpaths, and upgrading those so it doesn't build from new. It's transformative because it requires radical policy change and can have a real impact on our climate and people's lives. And we think it's replicable across all scales, so county, country, and possibly even in different parts of the world. So next slide. Thank you very much for listening to us. You can read more on our websites, and we have written in various guides and books. And we look forward to responding to questions and having a discussion. Thank you.
Thank you both very much. That was really fascinating, and also I think incredibly hopeful that things can be done differently and better. So I know we've already got quite a few questions for you. Please do continue to put your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. We're going to move on to our next speaker and then take the questions at the end of this next talk. So keep on popping your questions into the question and answer box. So I'd now like to welcome our next speaker, who is Will Haynes. Will is a chartered civil engineer, and for the last 10 years, he's worked for Sustrans in a range of design and engineering roles, and he's currently infrastructure director. In this role, he has technical oversight of Sustrans design and engineering work, providing guidance and training to colleagues and partners and technical assurance for projects. So welcome, Will, and on with your talk.
Thank you, Julia, and thank you. Good morning to everyone, and thank you to the TCPA for inviting me to speak on the subject of quiet lanes and lower speed environments and how these could support and promote rural active travel. And hopefully this will complement the last presentation. And thank you, Julia, for that word describing it, hopeful. I was trying to search for a word to describe that excellent presentation, and yeah, really felt sort of full of hope from it. I'm going to think more about the connections between settlements in this presentation. And I'd like to start by telling you a tale of two journeys. So next slide, thank you. Here are two journeys that I've made regularly at different times in my life. And on the face of it, they look relatively similar lengths. The times given by Google are quite optimistic, but nevertheless similar length journeys. Next slide, please. However, they're quite different. The journey on the left was my journey to secondary school, and the journey on the right is my journey to work at the moment. And the difference is that I would never have cycled to school, whereas I would now never drive to work. Why the difference? One key difference, I think, is the lack of infrastructure to facilitate my journey to school, which would have involved cycling on relatively fast, open rural roads, such as in the picture there. Whereas my journey into Manchester city centre is on relatively protected infrastructure. I think there's also a perception that active travel doesn't work in rural areas because the distances are too great. And I'd argue that this is not always the case. And taking the example of my journey to school, it was shorter than my current journey to work. Next slide, please. Most trips in England are relatively short. And yes, the data will be skewed by the fact that there are more shorter trips in urban areas. But even so, in 2021, the National Travel Survey found that 72% of all trips were under 5 miles. And 5 miles is a distance that many people could cycle, particularly with the increased uptake of e-bikes. And the image on the right illustrates this further by showing 5-mile radii circles on every town. And there are large parts of England, at least, where these circles are overlapping. So maybe rural journeys are not as long as we think they are. Next slide, please. A recent study carried out by the Centre for Research into Energy Demand Solutions, looking at the decarbonisation potential related to electric bikes, found that e-bikes, if used to replace car travel, have the capability to cut carbon dioxide emissions from car travel by up to 50%. It identified that the greatest opportunities are in rural and suburban settings, on the basis that city dwellers already have many low carbon travel options. So the greatest impact would be on encouraging use outside urban areas. It also found that there is scope for e-bikes to help people who are most affected by rising transport costs. And the quote that I put on the slide here from the study highlights what is needed to realise these opportunities. And I think in particular the section I've highlighted, suggesting the role of restricting car access or reducing speed limits on routes to towns to protect and enable cycling and e-biking. And working for Sustrans, it would be remiss of me not to highlight our vision for the National Cycle Network. That is to create a UK-wide network of traffic-free paths for everyone, connecting cities, towns, and countryside, loved by the communities they serve. Next slide, please. So how does this link to the creation of 20-minute neighbourhoods in rural areas? If we take the key element of 20-minute neighbourhoods as being connectivity within communities, I think in the rural context, this is also likely to require connections with neighbouring settlements on the basis that the services, the comprehensive services no longer exist in many settlements. And also worth noting that there may be a role to play for mobile services where the service comes to the people. And just thinking back to my childhood, the village I grew up in had a fortnightly mobile library and a fish and chips van that came once a week. In this presentation, so I'm going to focus on the inter-settlement infrastructure to facilitate these relatively short journeys between more rural settlements and to nearby towns. But again, reflecting on the previous presentation, it's important that improving connectivity between settlements supports the enhancement of rural communities. And it's not just about providing people within a rural community an easy way to get out into the nearest town. Next slide, please. So thinking sort of about the technicalities of what people want, people who are walking and cycling want, essentially they want infrastructure that is coherent, direct, safe, comfortable and attractive. In particular, they want to be protected from fast and busy motor traffic. Surveys regularly show that around 2/3 of people think that it is too dangerous to cycle on the roads. Unfortunately, there is a lack of walking design guidance. So we'll focus on cycling design guidance and in particular, Local Transport Note 120. This figure on the slide here, this chart, sets out the appropriate level of protection for motor traffic. And from it, we can see that for most people to be comfortable mixing with motor traffic, the speeds need to be below 20 miles an hour. The motor traffic speeds need to be below 20 miles an hour and the flows below about 2,500 vehicles a day. Unfortunately, the speeds on most rural roads will be quite a lot higher than 20 miles an hour, even if the flows may be relatively low. Therefore, suitable provision for people cycling will need to be provision that is protected from motor traffic. And by extension, we can assume that this is what people walking will want. So what does protected space look like in the rural context? Next slide, please. It might be a separated cycle track alongside a road, either within the highway boundary, as shown on the image on the left, or it might be immediately outside the highway boundary. And the image on the right shows how the path transitions and has been further into the photo, has been built in the field outside the highway boundary. This is great if the space is there and or there's willingness to acquire land. Although worth noting that it may not always tick the attractive core design principle particularly. Next slide, please. Alternatively, it might be the provision of a traffic-free route or a greenway, either a new purpose-built alignment, such as the image on the left, or utilisation of an existing corridor, such as a disused railway or a canal towpath. However, there are a number of challenges around providing protected space. Next slide, please. There is unlikely to be sufficient space within the existing highway boundary, in many cases, to retrofit a separated path. Acquiring land can be difficult, and there is a general reluctance to use compulsory purchase order powers to do so. Building new infrastructure is expensive where it's not possible to reuse existing infrastructure. Building new infrastructure will result in a loss of habitat, which will need to be offset. And the Environment Act 2021 requires a biodiversity net gain for new development. Building new infrastructure is at the bottom of the carbon reduction hierarchy, so should be the last thing that we're looking to do in striving for reduced carbon. And furthermore, in rural areas, the levels of use are likely to be relatively low, so it becomes harder to make the case. So is there an alternative? Next slide, please. If this was a more interactive forum, I'd ask you to spot the difference between these two, so you can sort of mentally spot the difference, if you like, between these two pictures. Obviously, plenty of differences. These are different places for a start, and yeah, a whole host of differences. However, next slide, please. Just to sort of give a bit more context of them, the image on the left is a traffic-free route, and the one on the right is a minor road. However, I'd suggest that there may be very little difference in terms of the width and the general characteristics. And the only tangible difference is the fact that the minor road will have motor vehicles on it, potentially driving at high speeds, which, as we noted earlier, will mean that most people cycling and walking will not feel comfortable sharing the carriageway with that motor traffic. So can we change things so that people walking, wheeling and cycling do feel comfortable sharing these minor lanes to avoid the need to build new traffic-free infrastructure? So this is where the quiet lane comes in. Next slide, please. Quiet lanes are rural lanes where motor traffic speeds and flows are sufficiently low for people walking, wheeling, cycling and riding horses to be able to share with motor traffic. The idea is to indicate to all road users that the whole surface of a lane is likely to be used by people walking, wheeling, riding and cycling, as well as those driving. They were first introduced in the early 2000s, and in England, the home zones and quiet lanes regulations were enacted in 2006. Whilst there's no statutory provision in Wales and Scotland, they are being implemented there. In Scotland, they're termed walking and cycling friendly roads. Next slide, please. Quiet lanes are not a new concept, and there are a number of local authorities who have implemented either quiet lanes or other similar initiatives going back to at least the early 2000s. And just a few images of signs associated with some of these initiatives. However, their uptake has been relatively localized, and there are lots of places where rural roads remain dominated by motor traffic. Again, there are a number of challenges around the widespread implementation of quiet lanes, and we'll run through those now, including inclusiveness, rural speed limits, highway engineering, urbanising the countryside, sat-navs, and public support. So on inclusivity, it's important to acknowledge that quiet lanes are unlikely to be fully inclusive infrastructure. In an urban area, we would not expect people walking and wheeling to share the carriageway with people driving, even in a 20-mile-an-hour speed limit controlled area. However, in a rural context, I think they may be a reasonable solution in some situations to providing significantly improved conditions for people walking and cycling. And I've also heard that from some users that actually they may prefer using a lane as opposed to a traffic-free route, as there don't tend to be any width issues or access control barriers. And I should just mention here that no harm came from allowing my son to walk in the middle of the road in this case. Next slide, please. One of the key factors in creating conditions that will facilitate use of quiet lanes by people walking and cycling will be the ability to control the speed of motor vehicles. I think it's fair to say that there's a general reluctance to lower speed limits on rural roads, particularly if they're not self-enforcing and or if there is no history of safety problems. And this is despite the Department for Transport circular on setting rural speed limits from 2013, explicitly stating that reducing speed limits to 40 miles an hour is a recommended approach where walking, cycling, horse riding, community or environmental factors are particularly important on any road section. Worth noting that often busier and bigger roads will have lower speed limits than more minor roads. I'm aware that just because, as in this image here, the speed limit is 60 miles an hour, it doesn't follow that I should drive at 60 miles an hour. However, I would suggest that the situation in this image here does present a somewhat mixed message. It's also worth acknowledging that speed limits do not necessarily translate to lower actual speeds, and the characteristic of the road will have a significant influence. But again, it is important to remember that LTN 120, the design guidance states that motor traffic speed should be below 20 miles an hour for most people to feel comfortable cycling with motor traffic. Next slide, please. Related to the speed limit issue, there are likely to be a number of highway engineering related challenges and tensions. Reducing the traffic flow may lead to increased speeds of the remaining traffic, and that's likely to be exacerbated if that traffic is more local and so knows that there is very unlikely to be someone coming the other way, so can take that bend faster than they might otherwise do so. There's also a tension between how much space and visibility there is along a lane and the speed at which people may drive. If we take this example in the photo here, it's very straight and open, so motor traffic speeds are likely to be far faster than on a bendy lane between high hedges. However, in the situation here, the wide verges and good visibility are likely to make it feel more comfortable for people not driving, for people walking, cycling, as they have room to move out of the way and will be more visible. Traffic calming solutions for built-up areas are well tried and tested. However, in rural areas, they are less well established, and there can be a reluctance to implement measures which are perceived to be for built-up areas in rural areas, which takes us to our next challenge. Next slide, please. One of the key measures likely to be required for successful implementation of quiet lanes is the provision of appropriate signing and markings to inform all users that they are in a different environment and need to modify their behaviour accordingly. Original quiet lanes guidance stated that signing for quiet lanes should be inconspicuous and recommended small signs mounted on timber posts in the verge. The concern being that too much by way of signing would adversely impact the rural environment. However, it's slightly stating the obvious, but inconspicuous signs are somewhat pointless. I realise that the adoption of emerging technology may have a role to play, which may reduce the need for signing. For example, if vehicle speeds were limited on quiet lanes, one could see there being less need, if any, for signing to reinforce lower speeds. Next slide, please. Just a small challenge, but one worth mentioning nevertheless. Before sat-navs were widely used, direction signing at junctions could be an effective way of not encouraging through traffic to use minor lanes. However, widespread use of sat-navs means that if the routing algorithm perceives the slightest time saving, it will route drivers along potentially inappropriate roads. Whilst this is usually more of an issue for larger vehicles, it can also increase the number of cars and vans using minor lanes, making them less attractive for people walking, wheeling, cycling, or riding horses. However, encouragingly, there appear to be moves, at least in built-up areas, for sat-nav routing algorithms to be changed to not route through traffic along inappropriate residential streets. And this might open the door to doing the same in the rural context. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Mine's still on challenges, sat-navs. Is there?
Not quite sure what's happened
Okay,
there.
I can talk to anyway. And the final challenge relates to public support. Effective community engagement is critical for the successful implementation of quiet lanes. And there have been a number of examples where quiet lanes have been abandoned, either prior to implementation or, as in this example here, well, the example there's a quote on the slide, following a trial due to a lack of public support. This was touched on in the first question session. It's expected that there will be parallels with low traffic neighbourhoods in urban areas around objections, some of which may be valid, others of which may be misplaced. And actually, I'll read the quote that was on the slide. Sorry, bear with me. It was a situation in Cornwall, in the area around Truro, and essentially the trial was not widely supported, and there's been no material shift in behaviour. As a result, the trial was ending. And the quote went on to say that the overriding majority of the approximately 200 comments, not a great deal of comments, number of comments, had been negative, and the majority of those comments came from motorists who had previously used the lanes as a shortcut to the main road. However, the public support is a key area, but the way to address that is to work with local community who are likely to be most impacted, hopefully more positively than negatively, by the implementation of a quiet lane. It will be key to ensure that they are engaged with and that they are brought on side and can understand the rationale and the benefits to them. I've got just a couple more points to make. I was going to touch very briefly on what are the solutions. I think there are sort of three levels of solutions for implementing quiet lanes, creating quiet lanes, and it all comes down to whether or not the existing motor traffic characteristics in terms of the speed and the flow meet those criteria that we're looking for. Where they do, then a due minimum level of provision should be all that is required, likely to comprise of some signing and gateway features to highlight the quiet lane. We're on slide 21, that slide, thank you. Sort of a due minimum approach just to highlight the state of the quiet lane, and that'll be sort of the quiet lane signing, gateway features, and so on. Where the motor traffic speeds are too high, implementing measures to reduce the motor traffic speeds, which might include reducing the speed limit and other interventions. And then thirdly, potentially measures to reduce the motor traffic flow, which might include point closures, weight and width restrictions, changing direction signage strategy. Next slide, please. So just in conclusion, many journeys in rural areas could be made more actively if the infrastructure was there to enable people to feel safe doing so. It's unlikely to be feasible to build new infrastructure in many places. And so repurposing existing minor rural lanes as quiet lanes could provide a solution. But it's important to stress that the motor traffic speeds in particular may need to be massively reduced if quiet lanes are to be as inclusive as possible. And even then, unlikely to be fully inclusive. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Will. And I'm so sorry that the slides disappeared partway through your presentation, but hats off to you for carrying on talking and keeping the pace going while your slides reappeared. So apologies for that, but thank you very much for that presentation. We now have a chance for questions for all three of our previous speakers. And we've had a lot of questions in the Q&A box. I don't think I'm going to be able to put all of them to everybody, but I will try and combine them as best I can. So first one, which I think I'd like to ask all of you, if you could answer relatively briefly, is what about people who are old or frail or a bit disabled, or perhaps live somewhere that has very steep hills, all of those practical problems? Sarah, I don't know, can I ask you to respond to that? You must get that question quite a lot, I'd guess.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. I mean, obviously, we want to make it as inclusive as possible for everyone, and there are an increasing number of new technologies coming forward for various electric mobility vehicles, and I think I cited probably, the electric buggy as a possible scenario for older people. Electric cargo bikes are super popular in Brecon, just outside where I live. The bike shop in Brecon, 90% of his sales now are electric bikes. Admittedly, not necessarily all older people can cope with that, but a lot of his customers are older people. So and I think as we've got a strategy here which is 20 years in the making going forward. So we will see more and more different modes of transportation coming forward that make that feasible. Judith might want to add a little bit there. I don't know.
Yeah, somebody mentioned in the chat as well about shared transport options, and very much that we talked about the mobility hub, which is well, it's much more than a mobility hub. It's a community hub that does multiple things. But the idea there that you could have shared vehicles for use by different members of the community. We could have adapted shared vehicles as well, also looking at more rural-based on-demand services. So we know that bus services are under pressure in rural areas, but with using smart technologies, having shared on-demand mobility, which is being trialled in some rural locations as well.
And also we're seeing increasingly more and more things that will come to us. And I think, as Will mentioned, the mobile library, healthcare is often a pop-up thing that can arrive, and again could come to one of the community hubs that we're talking about, where in each of these villages where these facilities are easily accessible.
Thank you. And we'll be hearing more about care later on, so do stay tuned into the webinar. Will, I don't know if you'd like to add something else about this issue of people who are less able, and also somebody's asked about sort of cold, dark nights in the countryside. It gets dark at 4 o'clock in the winter. Are people really going to go down narrow lanes on their own in the dark?
It's a really valid, important point, and that will be a challenge. And I don't think lighting country lanes is the answer. That's not going to be the answer. I've not really got anything to add to what Judith and Sarah said. Electric mobility will be key. I mean, can't stress enough that if we are expecting people to share roads with motor traffic, that dominance of the motor traffic needs to be absolutely reduced, both in terms of amount and speed. But yeah, and little things like making sure there's resting places so that people can rest frequently is really important as well.
Yeah, that is very important.
I think we are also just trying to, you know, there's a sort of mind shift in terms of this kind of sharing community, you know, so that there are now people will get to know each other more because they are going about daily journeys in and around their villages. And as a result, there's a greater support for each other. You know, you're going to bring in younger community families, etc., as well, and people can look after each other more and ensure that and share, you know, the different ways in which things can be delivered or acquired as and when. Yeah. And
I think so. Just to make another point, we're not. I don't think we're talking about sort of banning cars from rural lanes of villages. It's about the dominance, and it's about the ability for more people to be able to choose to travel differently, and the wider benefits that will bring.
Thank you. And Sarah and Judith, have you encountered any opposition to suggesting that people should leave their cars at the outskirts of a village rather than right next to their front door?
Judith, shall I say something?
I think you should answer that because you've been doing the work on the ground with the people who live around Blenheim. Yeah.
I think it is a gradual shift in terms of, we're not saying suddenly, you know, you're going to not be able to bring your car to your front door anymore. That's not what we're advocating. And the work we're doing with the Village Travel Network, which is this group of representatives from each of the villages around Blenheim Palace, is initially looking at some of the things that Will is talking about, which is looking to reduce speed, looking to upgrade existing footpaths and bridleways, to create these safer routes, and give people those options to travel differently. And again, it may not have been clear, but a lot of these footpaths and bridleways create a much more direct and shorter route between villages rather than having to go all the way around in a circular fashion and sit in a traffic jam. So there's a lot of people that already want that option, and that's what we're trying to look at. Next steps, we'll be trying to look at partial road closures. Again, not denying cars access, but trialing, certain roads which are underused anyway by vehicles or overused by as rut runs, as kind of car free at certain times of the day, to pilot those things. It's all very experimental, and I think there will always be people that find this difficult, but there seems to be a growing momentum of positive response to this, I think.
Just to add on that, it's quite interesting Matthew's put in the chat about the centre parks, because that has often come up in our conversations as a model, but also understanding the national picture where car usage is declining, particularly amongst men actually. So with women, car uses per mile passenger miles have been are quite low, but the whole picture of car usage is changing. So people are leaving these very expensive, high embodied materials on their driveways for 90% of the time are not doing anything as well. So it's really interesting to put it into the context of what's happening anyway.
I think it's also just a mind shift. It's perception, and we cited Dent earlier, that little village in Yorkshire Dales, but actually even in the villages around Oxford, there are some houses that historically never had a road to their front door. They've just got these little narrow pathways. So people have already got used to that. It doesn't reduce the value of the property. They're still considered to be beautifully, of high value and desirable properties. So it's a kind of like what you get used to and what you place, where your value is placed. And the same with Dent, people think it's a beautiful village to live in, and yet you can't actually take your car to the front door.
And we were talking about the national picture and sort of overall trends. We've also had quite a big shift in policy and the introduction of Active Travel England, which is an agency of the Department of Transport. And Will, I assume that Sustrans are working closely with Active Travel England, but are they interested in rural transport, or are they more focused on urban areas? And can you say a little bit more about what Sustrans and Active Travel England might be collaborating on?
Yes, we are working with Active Travel England. have been sort of since and before their inception. And I've had conversations with Brian Deegan, their head of inspections, around the need for rural design guidance to take the guidance in LTM 120 is intended to cover the full spectrum, but it is and arguably has an urban bias. So there is a need for some guidance that is more tailored to the rural setting. In particular, we're looking at working on some quiet lanes guidance at the moment.
That sounds really interesting.
Yeah.
And lots of people, or a couple of people in the question and answers have commented that in their areas, quiet lanes have been tried and didn't really work. Either people didn't like them or they didn't change people's behaviour. And I think that, do they have to look really different to make drivers behave differently? Because putting a sign up saying don't drive fast is not going to cut it, is it?
Yeah, no, it is about changing. It's about changing behaviour. It's about changing, and part of that will be driven by changing the look, the feel, the context of a rural lane, and there's a tension there between what scale of interventions go into a lane versus the effectiveness. It's a lot about behaviour change. It's about saying you're on a narrow lane. I always remember my dad teaching me when I learned to drive in a rural area, always imagine there's a tractor waiting to turn right around that next bend as you drive around it. And it's about changing that behavior, that actually you're driving down a lane, there could be your family could be around the corner. How would you behave? And we've got to change that culture, and it's going to be more about that than the infrastructure. However, there will be things we can do with the infrastructure to help reinforce that, I think.
Yes. And Sarah and Judith, this is quite a big question, and it may be too early to answer, but one of our participants says, have these projects helped to solve or at least minimise the loss of population in rural areas? Maybe it's too soon to answer that, but any thoughts about that?
It's definitely too soon to answer it, but that is the ambition, is to bring greater diversity of population as well, to support younger people to stay in rural places and create a greater diversity. But we're in planning stages, but I think there is really strong appetite and a recognition that by existing communities, that for those villages to thrive, there needs to be inward additional development to support those facilities and deliver the sort of climate resilience and restored habitats that they want.
I think we're also, we've got challenges with just the current planning policy, where housing mix is still putting far more emphasis on larger houses, 3-4 bedroom houses, over and above 1 and 2. So our challenge there is to reduce that and shift it the other way around, so that we can build smaller 2 beds and 1 beds, and older people can downsize from their large houses to smaller homes, and there are more affordable homes, and they're just a smaller, more compact, of scale as well, which I think is essential if we want to try and build within the village and not out in the countryside.
Yes, thanks. And one last question for all of you before we move on. How do you fund and deliver some of these projects quickly? Are there any quick wins to be had?
That's a difficult question.
It's a really difficult question, and I'm going to pick up some of the threads that are in the other chat. It definitely has been easier working with Blenheim because they're a landowner and they can do a bit more joined up approach. And so the submission that Sarah's talking about that we're making at the moment hopefully will support the council in their plans and creating a joined up approach. And so some of that network will be funded by the sort of wider strategic plans for Oxford and investment in cycling infrastructure there. And I think there was another question about how well we've worked with the with local authorities back in the Oxford-Cambridge corridor, and I think it's been much more challenging to get it embedded in there, but there is some. I've been particularly working with Central Bedfordshire Council, and we've managed to get some really good hooks in, given that they're a largely rural area. yeah, it's well, it's definitely been easy working with a single landowner.
Yeah. And Will, I don't know whether you can say anything, because it always strikes me when I hear how much a new motorway junction costs, which is millions and millions and millions. I mean, astronomically expensive. And then bike lanes and footpaths and benches and signs are actually really cheap, aren't they? Is there a possibility of shifting some of that huge money that's spent on roads into actually providing some of this much cheaper infrastructure?
Yes. Well, yeah, I mean, if you look at the amount of that's been spending is allocated to active travel, and more recently with the recent reductions, the comparisons are pitiful, and across the UK, the situation in England is very poor compared to Wales and Scotland. So yeah, we should be, and it wouldn't cost a whole lot more, because yeah, sorry, not much more to say on that one.
Okay, so active travel is getting...
Sorry, Judith, you go.
Go on, Sarah.
Well, I was just going to say, and also we do need to see investment in our public services. I mean, the bus and train travel, yeah. It's multimodal. We're not just talking about cycling and walking alone. Yeah. In order to decentralize private car use, we do need to have a proper integrated multimodal network, and that's really important.
Yeah, fantastic. So we're going to have to leave that there, but for Will and Judith and Sarah, there are some questions for you in the Q&A that we haven't answered. And if you want to answer them directly, I'm sure the people who put those questions would be absolutely delighted. But we now need to move on to our next speaker. So thank you all very much for those presentations. And we're now moving on to hear from Alison Macklin. Alison is the Community Business Manager at the Plunkett Foundation, and she specialises in supporting groups from their initial idea through to establishing and running community businesses and enterprises. And she also creates resources and hosts training on the Plunkett Foundation Training Hub. So Alison, welcome to the webinar, and we're looking forward to hearing from you, and I'll hand over to you now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And it's been absolutely fascinating to hear those presentations so far. We're now going to look a little bit about how other ways that communities, particularly rural communities, can be improved. So if we could just go to the next slide, please. So just for those of you that aren't aware, Plunkett is a national charity, and we are there to support community businesses. We've got a specific mission to create innovative, impactful and inclusive spaces. We are involved in representing community business and the rural sector to the government and other sectors. We provide practical advice, support and training to help communities establish and run successful community businesses with a long-term survival rate. Next slide, please. So what are community businesses? Community businesses are, generally speaking, enterprises that are owned democratically by their members. So they always have a wide and open membership. So it does mean that most of the community needs to at least support the idea, even if they're not directly involved. Generally speaking, a community business has a lot of democratic control, with members making decisions on behalf of their community. Because these organisations often have a closed membership, once it's been set up, those people are responsible. They have a committee and they have a general AGM. Most of the community businesses that we've been involved in generally have over 200 members involved in them, and they're providing something that the community wants and needs. People that are involved in a community business have a say in the direction that they want it to be, whether that is reopening a community pub or whether it is deciding what stock to stock in their shop. On average, most community businesses have over 28 local suppliers, so they help the economy, and they 100% of the community businesses that we deal with have specialised in local food. There's an estimated 1.1 million people benefit from community businesses in one way or another across the UK. Community businesses range in size, shape and format. They range from shops, which are the most common. There's now over 400 community shops across the UK, to pubs, which are now over 150. Two more niche ones. We've got community swimming pools, a community distillery, and more recently, there are more groups getting involved in community woodlands, community health, and community energy projects as well. So really the answer is, what are community businesses? It can be whatever the local community themselves desire and that have the will to try and create in order to improve their environment. Next slide, please. Community-owned businesses have a real benefit to their area. Particularly during COVID, this was found. Community businesses came to the forefront because they knew their customers, they knew their locals, and they were able to provide a personalised service. So whether that was delivering groceries to somebody direct or noticing that nobody had come along recently. This is also helpful for a wide sector of the community that utilise a community business. The elderly have a place often where they can meet, where people with dementia or other challenges can find a friendly and helpful place to be involved in, where no one is turned away because they don't have the right skills. A community business really is about bringing people together and involving them with being part of that business in order to make their whole community better. Next slide, please. So this is an example of a community pub, and there was a project a few years ago called The Pub is a Hub, and I think that that is really significant for a community business. It tends to be a hub. A lot of rural areas have lost or have declining church congregations. Possibly they're not getting the door-to-door service for milk every day. Postal services have declined. Public transport may have declined. And so a community business often becomes far more than what it says it is. So this is a pub called The Dog, and it set up several years ago now. It took them almost 8 years in total to get to save this pub. But as a result of it, they have a huge wide variety of things that they get involved in. So they have postal services, they have craft nights, they are involved in senior citizens meals, they have children's clubs, and they really have allow almost anybody to be involved in their pub. Other community businesses offer a huge range of services. So there are community shops that have post offices that offer craft sessions for people. There are mums and tots sessions, nosh and natter, the Spice Boys. Often these community businesses bring in people from the outside into the village. So that may well be the local community police officer may well spend some time within the community business to allow people to drop in. The local healthcare professionals may come in, the local minister may come in, the local police officers. So a huge range of people can bring skills in. So there is one community project, which is a shop downstairs. It has a room upstairs, and people can come in and utilise upstairs for getting in contact with people and learning computer skills one day, and then the next day they may well have a visiting podiatrist coming in. So those places really do find out what their community want and need. So to be involved in a community business from the start, before we get involved at Plunkett, the community has to do some community engagement. It's really important that it's not just a vanity project of a few people that think it would be nice to have something. It has to be something that the community themselves want or need. And it may well be about saving an existing business. So it may well be, for example, that a shop, the owner is retiring, and it's not an attractive business, perhaps because it hasn't got a great turnover and great profit margin to bring in one of the national chains. So having that opportunity to buy it or to rent it and to open it and keep it open is really vital. A lot of community businesses invoke an ACV, an asset of community value, which will allow a community to decide whether this is something that they really want in their community and think about how they can save it. In order for a community doesn't only have to take an existing asset, you know, a closing pub or something like that. It can build something from scratch in some ways, because it's something that they've identified that they want and need. But generally, most community businesses are there because there isn't an alternative for them, particularly in very rural areas. Next slide, please. So there's a huge impact with community businesses. They safeguard a huge variety of services for people that are really valued. They provide employment and training for people, and a lot of people may be excluded from the labour market, and in rural areas that may well be due to the fact that there isn't sufficient way for people to get to that labour market. We find increasingly that a lot of young people get their first opportunity of work or training through a community business in a rural area, because it means that they don't have to rely on the taxi of mum and dad, and they're provided with training and support. We also have a lot of people involved that may well be rejected or find difficult to find jobs in the world of work in the normal way. So we have one group where they are involved with dementia awareness, and they have set up their community business so that it is that it helps people with dementia deal with it. So the lighting is correct, the layout is correct. And because these businesses are not designed to make a huge profit, and what profit they do make goes back into their community, it does mean that the community can take a slightly more sympathetic approach, because it doesn't need to satisfy shareholders in the normal sense of things. Lots of the communities help revitalise their local economy. As I say, most community businesses use up to 28 local suppliers or producers, ranging from getting their local milk and their ice cream to sourcing local crafts, local charcoal, whatever it is that that community may have. Because those community villages are rural, generally speaking, they tend to be more eco-friendly. It's often a major part of a community business's business plan is to be as ecologically friendly as they can be. And that could be the fact that they are reducing the number of journeys out of the locality to the nearest towns. So if you have a community shop, it doesn't mean you won't necessarily still need to go to the supermarket, or you won't have the supermarket come to you, but it does mean that you'll be cutting down the number of times you can go. And often the community businesses that we speak to say that they're able to offer a better price for some of their local goods and services, and where they can't, so they can't compete for perhaps the big brand names. But when people factor in the time that it would take them to get in their cars or on the bikes and go out of their village and possibly pay for parking and their time, that actually the extra 20 or 30p on the product is worthwhile, along with all the other assets that having a community business may have. Those community businesses really can promote diversity and inclusion and make sure that they're welcoming places for people. So often they provide services for visitors as well, whether that is tourist services or whether it's just offering a welcome cup of tea. And of course, they range. One of the vital things that community businesses do is tackle that range of social issues, particularly isolation, lack of public transport, mental health. So, for example, the health and well-being sector, a lot of community businesses have gone down the route of having defibrillators. They provide training. They have things like chatty cafes involved with them. They often host things like Men's Shed. And of course, people getting involved in community businesses may also find themselves volunteering within the community business itself, which brings a lot of health and well-being benefits to those individuals, whether it's the fact that they are learning new skills, whether it could be the fact that they feel that they're giving something back to their community. It could be the fact that they are wanting to learn skills for work. It could just be the fact that they're wanting to keep their mind and body active. It could be the fact that they're volunteering and that gives them the chance to go out of the house and meet people, make new friends, or it could just be the fact that they want to learn the latest gossip. So there are huge benefits for volunteers to get involved in community businesses, bringing people together. The sector has over 21,000 volunteers involved in it, and the sector also has employed over 4,000 people within the community business sector. So that really does mean that we're not a small sector. We can really make a difference. So there's a huge social impact for having a community business, that sense of ownership, that sense of pride, and that feeling of empowerment. Next slide, please. So the Dog Inn, as I mentioned earlier, they're not only a pub, but they also have a shop and a coffee shop. They have a community rooms upstairs. They have the church service every month. They do things like Easter egg hunts, royal weddings, and celebrations. So it really does show that actually more than one business can deal within one location. So whether that is a pub that does all this, whether it's a community cafe that also takes in people's post, whether it is a building that has been saved in some way. And we'll talk a little bit more about different kinds of buildings on the next slide, please. So just to let you know a few facts, the community business sector grew over 3% in 2021, despite the challenges of COVID, and there's now over 840 community businesses trading across the UK. It's a really important sector that has a lot of value to it. So I did mention earlier about shares. Shares are a way for the community to get involved. So some groups will not need to raise a lot of finance in order to set up their community business. They may well just be able to rent at a nominal sum part of their village hall. It could be that the asset has been gifted to the community in some way, or that they have a socially caring landlord. But shares will help a group raise funds to buy their business in some way. And recently, in the last year, over 170,000 people invested in community businesses, and across the UK, over £48 million was raised through community businesses. And last year, that was 3.4 million, with over 6,300 shareholders. So it is a substantial number of people getting involved in community businesses. These businesses have an excellent chance of survival Nationally, the 5-year survival rate is 44% for community businesses. It's over 92% for shops and over 99% for community pubs. And the reason for that is that people want them. And if they have been involved in getting involved, whether that's as volunteer or whether they have bought shares, they are more likely to use that community business. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, there are a lot of impacts by having a local community business. And those communities happen in lots and lots of different ways. So there is the way of reusing buildings. So those buildings may be empty. Those buildings may well have a different purpose. So one of our community shops was actually an old toilet block that was shut down. The local council couldn't afford to run it anymore, and so they reused that, and they've made a lovely little shop with a public toilet in the corner that customers and visitors can use. A lot of other communities have decided that they can't afford to perhaps build, and they've utilised space that is owned by their council, and have put on porta cabins, shipping containers, caravans, in order to have a place for people to meet and utilise it. A lot of these community businesses are not only involved in isolation, transport, things like that. They provide a huge number of services that may not be easy to access. So a lot of them have food banks, a lot of them offer IT services, they offer postal services, that many of them have an allotment with a real commitment to local food. And they have these services like book exchanges, knitting groups, and as I say, things like the Spice Boys. So there is a huge impact by having a community business. And normally there is a space for something. So businesses, as I say, can either be started from scratch, or they can be utilised an existing asset. A community business can be defined in different ways. So a community business can be owned and run by its community. Alternatively, it could be owned by the private sector and just run as a community project, or it could just be that the community own the asset itself and they put in a professional private organisation within that. So that's quite common, for example, within pubs, that they put in a professional tenant, but the community itself owns the asset and can help direct what they want their tenant to provide. Next slide, please. So one of the reasons many community businesses fail to reach trading stage is the lack of a suitable venue. At the same time, lots of places of worship across the UK are facing increasing costs to keep these historic businesses, both buildings, viable and sustainable. They're often very expensive to run, expensive to heat. Community businesses and places of worship share many of the same goals: serving the community, acting as a hub for the community. And so one of the projects that Plunkett is running at the moment is a Places of Worship campaign, supported by an alliance of faith organisations and relevant stakeholders. We're committed to the concept of growing the number of community businesses co-locating in places of worship. We've had generous support from the All Churches Trust, and able to provide bespoke business support and micro grants to find out the feasibility of utilising for groups that are looking to establish community businesses within active Christian places of worship, and that's both rural and urban. It's important to say that as part of our wider Places of Worship campaign, we're keen to work with other faiths to explore how this co-location model could benefit their places of worship and the communities they serve.
Alison, we're running out of time a little bit. Are you coming towards the end?
I am. I'm just going to show couple of different examples for you of other businesses. So next slide, please. So this is an example of St Leonard's in Yarpole in Herefordshire, and the funds raised by the community shop and cafe have insulated the church roof, paid for the underfloor heating, and made it a much more comfortable and user-friendly space. Next slide, please. This is the cafe upstairs, which has locals plus walkers and cyclists throughout the week. Next slide, please. This is an example of in Hampshire. They've saved their Norman church and they've engaged, they've got grants of up to £80,000. They have this community cafe with local people making tea and cakes. And they have so many people wanting to volunteer and get involved that they're now open Monday through to Saturday. And their 3 objectives are to continue to look after the church, to promote their heritage, and to broaden the community activities. Next slide, please. This is a little Welsh shop located in a church hall, and they have the church heating grant, and they have co-location with lots of people coming in at different times. So it's acting as a mixture of a village hall, a church hall, a shop, and a cafe as well. Next slide, please. And final example, this is Chalk Valley Stores, and they were set to lose their shop and post office, and the congregation had dwindled and they couldn't provide for the upkeep of the church. And so what they have done is they brought the shop and the post office into the church, and it's actually resulted in an increase in their congregation, as well as having a core of volunteers and regular people meeting on an ad hoc basis. And in the evenings, the churches host things like cheese and wine evenings. So a huge variety of things. So really, I think that the message is that community businesses can be a really good answer, particularly for rural areas, to bring people together, to inspire them, and to get them involved in the shared aim of improving their communities.
Thank you very much, Alison. That was a really interesting overview and some fascinating insight into how durable and successful so many of those community businesses are. So if you have any more questions for Alison, do put them in the Q&A box. I can see we've got some already. We're going to take questions at the end. So now we're going to move on to our next speaker. And so our final speaker is David Patterson. David is the founder and chair of trustees of Withy Cares. His career spanned social work and founding a successful fostering agency. David set up Withy Cares 6 years ago, and he's working to manage its growth and the possibilities of the model developing more widely across Somerset and beyond. So earlier this morning, we heard from Carlos Moreno talking about care as one of the important elements of a successful 15 or 20-minute neighbourhood. So we'd love to hear more about this. David, over to you.
Okay, thank you. Well, Withy Cares is a community response to the care in the elderly crisis, and as you say, it fits very well with most of the topics that have already been discussed this morning. Basically, we started off looking at the unsolved problem of care in the community of the elderly. And this had happened over many decades. We've had government reports and various governments and various reports. They've had ideas about what to do. They tinker with funding, they tinker with numbers, and never actually change anything. It's always the same sort of factors that they're sort of looking at. And we felt in with Liscombe that a different approach was needed. It was totally at a standstill. It's just drifting backwards and backwards. And as you all know, it comes up in the press and the news very regularly. And for us, crucial issues were that there were a lack of carers, there was a lack of funding, and there was an increased need for care. Sorry, you haven't we haven't moved a slide, have we? Yeah, this is the first slide. So there you have it. And really a completely different approach needed to be if we were going to change delivery of service for the people most in need in the community. Wivliscombe is a small town in West Somerset, and it comprises of a large area, a large rural area of 10 villages. And you know, there's very little services, of poor transport, there's little access to resources. And so something had to change, you know, and I think it offered us an opportunity to look at what we as a community needed to improve the dynamics for this sector. And we started off by, sorry, next slide, please. I'll get around to used to that in a minute. Community meetings. So we had 2 community meetings in the local library, and quite a number of people came. We were surprised how many people came, but we put the idea in very rough form because we didn't have our ideas really sorted out, to be honest, at that point. But they were unanimously supportive of us going ahead and developing this project to see if it worked. And for us, the key issue was for carers. Now, caring in the community is a really difficult job, and caring in homes is a very difficult job. But consistently, no matter how difficult the job, it's very low pay, very low status, and very high schedules. So carers came from agencies, and they have their carers were sort of dashing about all over the country. And this is not a criticism, it's of them, it's a criticism of the system. And increasingly they were sort of, instead of going in for the hour, they were going in for a quarter of an hour, 20 minutes, doing the job and moving on, and not developing a relationship with their clients. In addition to that, carers would put, the alternative to that was carers putting their adverts in a local shop window and saying, I'm a carer, come and get me, without any sort of control or sort of monitoring whatsoever. And it was our belief that there were lots of untapped resources in the community, you know, people wanting to help, people wanting to lead, people who are, you know, people are retiring, and they're retiring fit and well and not wanting to sort of just give up work and not do anything else. And we believe that, you know, there were people that would do things to help their community, but there was no sort of structure to support them and no sort of general philosophy across the country to actually sort of say, oh, we can change this. There's also locally a need for more meaningful employment. We're a rural area, and the only employment, particularly for young people, well, not just for young people, anybody in the area, all the employment was basically minimal age. And we also believe that in caring in the community, almost everybody, most adults, have this basic skills already available. We've all cared for people. We've cared for, you know, ill family members. We've cared for family members in trouble. We've looked after parents. We've looked after youngsters. And so the basic core skills people already had within themselves. So we strongly believe that. And finally, on this page, we're talking about the resources available in the community. There are various support services, but not linked. The local community knows the needs of the resort within the community and the networking within the community. And it does tap into what was mentioned some years ago by David Cameron, the big society, which never got off the ground. And, you know, one may question the objectives and the politics of it, but at the same time, big society fitted in very much with the concept of community. And so, but sadly that was dropped, and, you know, communities for many decades now have not been, they've been looked down upon, you know, as 1960s concept rather than sort of, and we've all lost all connection with communities, and that again, it sort of takes us back to some of the speakers we've had already. Next slide, please. So, with the support of our local community, what were our initial objectives? First of all, was there a different way of complementing the services already available and increase resource capacity? And this was absolutely crucial. And we felt that, you know, up in Whitehall, they were sort of had this rigid way of looking at the two elements, finance and need, and actually not looking things with left field and saying, oh, there may be another way of looking at it. So the objective was to bring in a local service for what is a national service, a local authority service, and develop, increase the capacity, as I say, by having more carers and making much more use of the good networks which were already in place. So the objective, you know, the primary objective for the clients was to keep them in their homes longer, keep them in familiar surroundings, keep them in contact with family and friends. And we all know if somebody goes into a home or whatever, that rapidly those friends and family drop off from visiting. And the outcome of this all for the client would be maintaining their physical and mental health, which we all know rapidly deteriorates when they're removed from their home, removed from their family, and their locality. We thought we might be able to reduce, by increasing capacity, we could reduce waiting times from hospital discharge. And, you know, we've just got to get somebody out of hospital one night earlier, and that'll save £600–700. You know, so that we sort of hope to remove the blockaging there. And what some of the figures that we were looking at, the carers who with an agency would get just above the minimum wage probably. If they were self-employed carers, they could earn up to 50% more, and our carers actually can charge, most of them charge about £18 an hour. But if the local authority, and that's per hour, and the local authority would pay 30% less. So if they're paying an agency to go into a home, they pay something in the region of about £28, and our carers charge 18, as I say. So that's a 30% less. So it seems to be win-win-win right down the line, and but it does need some funding, you know, and that is absolutely crucial. We have to keep that in mind all the way through. This is not a free ride for the government. They still have to support it, but it's actually hugely financially in their interests and a way of sort of developing the problems that they're facing at the moment. Next slide, please. So from the outset, as I say, local authority support was crucial. We've not had financial support, but moral support, guidance, approval were all really, really important. And it was the only way we could get going. And we Somerset is quite lucky, really, because we've had people at County Hall running community enterprise departments, which encouraged what, I hate the jargon, but it's self-employed carers, and they call them micro providers. So they're all individual, their own businesses. So they set up the micro provider scheme, and that fell very closely in line with our ideas of having local carers meeting local need. So we had that strategic support from them. We also linked up very much with local agencies. So that was the health service and local authority. We got advice and support about funding, as I say. We agreed procedures and policies, and we had networking links. You know, being a community, there were networking links already, and all of us involved with cares, the GPs, the hospitals, social services. We have village agents in each town, and the hospital discharge scheme, and all the other voluntary groups that are already operating within WIVI. Sorry, I don't think I mentioned WIVI is short for Wiveliscombe. That's a bit of a mouthful. So the hospital discharge schemes immediately would contact WIVI Cares. Next slide, please. So the model we had, firstly, we agreed the form of local charitable status, and we got that fairly readily. We recruited a coordinator. This is a crucial role, and actually is the only key expense we have, just to have a coordinator. And the group WIVI Cares is managed by the trustees. The trustees are also the management committee, and a dedicated phone line was created. And so there was a single point of contact within the whole area for anybody who was in need of care. And this coordinator, she would register, sorry, I say she, I shouldn't say she, but they've all been, we've had 3, and they've all been female so far. So we created a register of micro providers, self-employed carers, and we talked to all the GPs in the area. We talked to the hospital, we advertised it on local radio, and the whole process was, in the first couple of years, was raising community awareness of our existence. And so much so that now the whole area knows about WIVI Cares, and if they're in need of care, they immediately know where to go to. So there's quicker access, quicker response, and quicker confidence in the whole care process. So what we do, we get referrals, and we get the referrals from the GP, all the people we've been in contact, the GP, the village agent, the hospital discharge, adult social care, families, clients. They all know that we're on the end of the phone. And basically it's 24 hours a day, but normally it's people are more respectful of that and just ring us Monday to Friday. And the whole process, as I say, is linking appropriate carers to meet the client's needs. And we also encouraged our carers to find a buddy, so if they were ill, sick or anything, they had somebody to step in. So the whole process was a local process. It's been highly respected and taken on board by the local council, from whom we get service level agreement every year now. And the community speak really highly of and very appreciatively of what we're doing. Next slide, please. So WIVI Cares recruitment, and as fundamental was the need to attract new carers. So we did intensive local advertising, raised community awareness. All carers, and this is the whole sort of exciting thing about it, all carers are local and have rapid access to local clients. And just as an example, that we had a crisis on one Saturday afternoon when a carer was taken into hospital and a client was in bed without food or water. And within 23 minutes of the coordinator being contacted, we had a carer going into the client. We now have 40 carers in our area, and that's 35 new carers coming into the caring profession. And they all work different hours. They determine their own time scales. It fits in with their local demands, you know, taking children to school. Sometimes it complements a bit of work that they're already doing, but everything is contained locally. And also what we found out, and this is something that we've not really anticipated in the beginning, was that local carers and clients seem to create a security and responsibility to their community. So the clients talk to the carers, and you know, they know each other. The clients know the history of the area, so the carers are interested in what the clients have got to tell them. And I think it's that has largely led to only 2 complaints in 5 years, which is quite remarkable for the client group we're serving. Next slide, please. So 5 years on, where are we? We've got 40 carers, as I've already said. 35 of those are new to caring, and if you multiply that up across the country, you know, just think how many more carers we could have, and how big a dent it could make in, or resolution it could make to the problem of this crisis that the country has. We have completed over 300 attendance allowance forms. Now, this was crucial. Our second coordinator knew all about attendance allowance when she came to us, and she's applied for over 300. This has been 100% successful at the higher rate, because she knows what to say, which means more care, more local employment, and more is spent in the local community. And that the total funding coming into the community from those attendance allowances is now over £1.5 million. So the carers get more care, as I say, there's more employment locally and more is spent in the community. So it's all great. So there's no hospital discharge waiting list, and few waiting for a full care package. There are some waiting for their care packages to be complemented, and though there are gaps in their need. But we work with families, and if we take a lot of pressure off families and friends, they can then have the energy to step in. We've set up a memory activity group, and this was a slow start, but is now becoming another established group in the community. We actually risked some of our funding to get this going, but that is now working well for us. And research suggests that this model is still unique in the country, but word is spreading in towns across Somerset, and county councils are interested. I spoke to 46 county councils a couple of weeks ago across England, Scotland and Wales, and that received a very good response too. So, but the priority locally is to establish it across towns in Somerset. I should also say that all this locality work reduces, improves the environment, improves the health of the people working. So again, there are so many positives of actually saying let's bring some of our support work back in within the community.
David, could you draw to a close soon as we're running out of
next
time?
slide, please.
Thanks.
Next slide. Yeah, fine. So we work with working within community. Have I missed a slide? Yeah, work with agencies. We complement and not compete. Financial support is needed. We need to check this viability across different communities, because I believe this can work rurally and in an urban capacity. And it's crucial it becomes a key part in seeking care, and have to ask, are there any serious alternatives? And I would say that, you know, I would use the title of a book I have here, Humanizing Healthcare, which is a great book, but it, you know, it's a book that can be applied to different sectors within different communities, I think. And can I just give finally my own personal telephone number in case anybody wants to contact me? Is that allowed? Is that?
Yes, if you want to.
Yeah,
David,
I'd like to do it, because I prefer you not to use the number on the little logo we've got, because that takes up our coordinated.
Would you like to type it into the chat at the bottom of the screen after you finish speaking?
Yeah. Yeah, I will stop there and hand back to you.
Thank
Julie.
you so much, and I'm sorry to rush you.
No, that's
there
all
was
right.
so much that was interesting in there, but I want to make sure we've got time for some questions.
Yeah.
So we've just had two really fascinating presentations about things that are clearly very, very successful and solving lots and lots of problems. And so I think one of the questions is there a need for much more sort of cross-organisational working to get things like the wonderful things we've just heard about happening in more places? Alison, I wonder if you'd like to go with that first.
Definitely, we see that groups that are most successful are the ones that reach out and get the support from their local council. They speak to their local business link, kind of their Chamber of Commerce, and they really get involved. There are some national groups that can help and support community businesses. But really, with all these things, the more community engagement, the more participation from a wide range of people brings all those different skills and will make any project more likely to succeed.
And Alison, do you think if somebody's setting up a community project of whatever sort in a rural area, who would they go to in the council? Would they go to a district council or the county council? And who would they ask for? Where would they start? We would normally recommend that you speak, of course, first of all to your local council, because they are the ones that will need to give you the most support. And we actually wrote a report just over a year ago, which is how community businesses and local councils can work together. And it's got loads of advice and case studies. And I'm happy to send that out to anybody that would like to have a read of that, because that was designed for local councils. But undoubtedly, at some point, if there's planning and things, it will need to go up to the next level. But also it can come down. You know, sometimes counties, parish plans, all those sort of things come first, where they've identified an issue, and then it's about how the community can respond to that issue. But normally it's ground up is the way that we see the most successful groups. Yeah, thank you. And David, it was really heartening to hear about the work you're doing. I think particularly the increased wages for carers, and clearly the better care that people are getting when they're not relying on somebody to dash in and dash out. And so there's so many good things about what you're talking about. Do you think there is potential for it to be replicated across the country?
Absolutely, I do. You know, I think, first of all, if they get decent wages, their own self-esteem and status in the community is very, very different. And, you know, they stay in the job much longer. And we keep people in their homes much longer and don't need residential care. But yes, going on, I really believe it can be. I think everybody, wherever they live, whether it's in Lambeth or rural Wales or wherever, people refer to a hub, be it as a town centre or see themselves as part of an area. And I think there are the resources, there are people within all those areas that are available, would want to be involved in something community if they were given just a little bit of direction and encouragement.
Yeah, and we've got another question for you here, which is, to what degree is Wivy Cares self-financing, and to what degree are you reliant on grants? You said that understandably some funding is needed. Where does that come from?
We're not self-financing at all. You know, what we'd like to do is charge people for doing attendance allowance forms, you know, that would bring in income. But no, we're not. So we're constantly haggling for grants, probably 3 or 4 times a year, just to keep us afloat. But we are making progress on that, I think. I'm keeping my fingers crossed, because the reputation we've established is encouraging the local authority to work with us to try and find, you know, something more akin to 3-year contract funding. So hopefully that will enable us to sort of focus on creating a better service rather than just getting funding for the services we're operating at the moment.
Yes. Well, I really hope that you do, and you can spend your time more fruitfully.
Yeah.
Alison, there's a question for you. Are there any other organisations involved in supporting the creation of community businesses in the UK and Scotland?
Yes, there's a number of partner organisations that we work with, and we encourage groups to speak to them as well, because every organisation has its own set of skills that it can bring to it. In Scotland, a lot of the work is led by Community Development Scotland and Community Shares Scotland. In Wales, most of it is led by Compass. And in the UK, of course, UK-wide, there is Cooperatives UK and Locality. But there's advice as well from professional organisations as well. So if you were setting up a community pub, for example, you might also look at things like the Innkeepers Association. If you were setting up a community shop, you might also look at the Association of Convenience Stores. But generally speaking, most partner organisations that we speak to are generally, they don't hug it to themselves. They recognise that for community businesses to succeed, they need as much help and support as possible, whether that's with funding, business planning, or how to manage your committee. You know, it varies.
And what could local councils do to enable more community businesses to flourish?
It's about thinking about what it is that your community needs and engaging. For a lot of groups, that it comes out of their parish plan, or it comes out of the threat of closure of a much loved asset. For a lot of groups, it may well be that that asset has more value as a residential building. And so it is about getting the council to support perhaps protecting it as an asset of community value. It may well be about double checking, you know, what difference it would make to the community if it wasn't there, and allowing the groups to think laterally about it. There's also councils can also offer public works loans as well, which give favourable terms, and they can also perhaps also help with grant applications for groups as well.
That's really helpful. And so it sounds as though you think that the ability to designate assets of community value has been a useful extra tool in the toolkit, if you like, for local communities.
It certainly seems to be, and in Scotland in particular, there's a lot of that kind of asset transfer as well, which is a long process, but it's seeing more use at the moment, and hopefully it does mean that groups will be able to see some inspiring projects and think we could do something like that in our area. It's not out of the bounds of possibility.
And one that perhaps both of you might like to ask is, has the closure of village banks or local bank branches been a problem for you, or is everything now being done in a cashless way? David, how about you setting up Wivy Cares? Do you need cash? Do you need a bank, or is it all online now?
Well, what we do have is a fantastic post office in our town.
Yeah.
Absolutely wonderful. We use that as our bank, really, and it sort of takes deposits, payments, and cash and what have you.
Great.
So we are very lucky to have sort of lucky the most to have a good post office.
And Alison, is the closure of banks a problem for the people that you're working with?
It can be. Certainly, it's very difficult for community businesses to set up their bank account in the first place. The banks are taking an awfully long time to do that. But in addition to that, we are seeing the fact that a lot of community businesses actually offer things like cashback and not taking commission on that. And it's really important as well for those community businesses to still offer the facility for people to pay in cash. Particularly, some people may not feel comfortable if they're on a tight budget, or they don't like the idea of using their cards for small purchases. So we still encourage all community businesses to try, where possible, to facilitate cash as well as card. But I think that it can be a challenge. But if you are coming across a bank that is refusing to recognise community businesses, then do contact us and we would put them in contact with the FCA, because it may well just be that the bank doesn't understand the model, and so we can help provide them with that information. That's brilliant. That's really practical and helpful. Thank you very much. There's one other question in the chat, which was about neighbourhood plans, and if anyone is interested, do keep an eye on our website, because later this summer I hope we'll have some more helpful free advice regarding 20-minute neighbourhoods and neighbourhood planning. Meanwhile, I'm going to draw this session to a close. It's been a very long morning, and I'm sure everybody needs to get up and stretch their legs. I'd like to thank all of our speakers. We've had a fantastic range of different perspectives on how 20-minute neighbourhoods or complete, compact and connected places could be put into practice in rural areas. Lots and lots of food for thought, and I hope that answers some of the questions that people have put to us over the last 2 years about, well, 20-minute neighbourhoods are all very well, but they won't work in the countryside, will they? And I think we've seen that, yes, they can work, and they are working in, and hopefully will continue to develop and thrive, because there's clearly so much innovation going on in rural areas. So I'd really like to thank all of our speakers today for providing such a range of interesting perspectives. Do have a look at our website for our free resources that you can download. If you go to the TCPA website and search for 20-minute neighbourhoods, you'll find lots and lots of useful things. Thank you very much. There's the web address. If you found today's webinar interesting and useful, I'd like to really encourage you to join the TCPA. The TCPA is a membership organisation and a charity, and we really need all the support we can get to carry on our work. So again, look at our website, and if you search Join the TCPA, there'll be more information there. Finally, I'd like to thank all of today's speakers, but also my colleagues Gemma Hyde and Abby Grove White for working behind the scenes to make it all happen. Gemma has posted a lot of useful web links and David's phone number in the chat, so do have a quick look at the chat. We will be putting the recording of this webinar on our website very soon, so if you've missed anything, you'll be able to catch up. So once again, thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you to our speakers, and we hope to see you again at another TCPA webinar.